Well, good evening, everyone, as we gather in our homes scattered around West Philadelphia and Lord knows where else, to celebrate this institution of the Eucharist and the institution of the priesthood through which the Eucharist comes to us. Within the past 5 years, the most popular Broadway musical is entitled Hamilton. And Hamilton is about the life of Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of our country. And the play is all about how the revolution was going to be a pivotal moment in the world, to say the least. And so there's a scene in the first act where Hamilton and 3 or 4 of his friends are sitting at a bar and they're toasting each other, so confident that this was going to be an earthquake in the world and America would be set free from British tyranny. And as they're doing so, they sing a song. And the song that they sing is the story of tonight. And as they sing it, they are just full of confidence that this is going to change the world and be a pivotal moment in human history. Well, I think that as the apostles sat around in that upper room some 2,000 years ago, I'm not so sure that they were quite as confident that what they were doing that first Holy Thursday at the Last Supper in the upper room would be a pivotal moment in human history. And yet, here we are, celebrating the story of that night on this night, some 2,000 years later, as we celebrate that first Holy Thursday with the Mass of the Lord's Supper. And just to recap what we've been doing thus far, we began by listening to the story of the Passover from the book of Exodus, as the Jewish people seek their liberation from Egyptian slavery. And then we moved on to St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And in that letter, St. Paul gives us his account of what took place at the Last Supper. But then we have this gospel, which I just proclaimed, where Jesus gives us his mandate to be like him. And so the story of this night and the story of that night 2,000 years ago really comes down to 2 things that we celebrate this evening. Jesus giving us the Eucharist, giving us himself, and Jesus giving us the priesthood. In the Eucharist, which I know so many of you are longing for in this moment of our exile during this coronavirus plague, in the Eucharist, Jesus gives to us his body and his blood, his soul and divinity. But then he also gives to us the priesthood. And the reason Jesus gives us the priesthood is that the priesthood becomes the vehicle through which he can give to us his body and his blood, his soul and his divinity. And why does Jesus give us himself? Why does Jesus give us the priesthood? So that we can be like Jesus. So that we can be Jesus to the world. So that we can take the saving message of Jesus Christ to the world that so desperately needs that message now more than ever. But as we learned in our gospel just a few moments ago, bringing Jesus to the world, to all those who need him, that's really hard. Because friends, if we want to follow Jesus, we better look good on wood. And we just saw that in the gospel, how hard it is to be like Jesus. We heard in this night's gospel Jesus performing this incredible act of love, this magnificent act of charity, as he falls to his knees and he washes the feet of each and every one of his disciples, of his apostles, I should say. He takes the form of a slave, and he serves those who are in need. We'll see it again tomorrow at the Good Friday service. We see all of that dysfunction on display. We see the denial of Peter, the betrayal of Judas. We see Jesus crucified and forgiving the thieves that are on either side of him, and forgiving those who have actually crucified him. If we want to follow Jesus, which is what this night is all about, then we better look good on wood. And that's why Jesus gives us himself in the Eucharist. He gives us himself, a share in his body and blood, a share in his soul and divinity, so that we can follow him and be Jesus to one another. Friends, that's the story of this night. That's the story of that night. The story is a pivotal one in human history. And you know what, friends? There is no doubt that right now, the world is at a pivotal moment in all of history, as we find ourselves in the grip of this plague of coronavirus. And I am absolutely certain that science is going to solve this. But I am equally certain that Jesus has come to save us. That's the story of this night at this most pivotal point in human history. Well, just 3 months ago, I was blessed to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It was my 4th such trip, walking in the footsteps of Jesus, joined by friends from across the country, from Texas and Tennessee, from California and Kentucky. There, in the old city of Jerusalem, we walked the way of the cross, passing shops and souvenir stores, all of whom were selling cards and olive wood crosses. We prayed at each of the stations, and we saw all the sights mentioned in this gospel. But there was one sight that stood out, that being the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's passion and death and resurrection. It's an old church and very hard to get around. And once you enter, you go through a dark and smoky chapel where candles burn and monks pray and incense fills the air. And then you arrive at a small place beneath a marble altar. It's a spot that's only a few inches wide. And so you bend down and see a dark hole in the stone floor. With fear in your heart, you crouch down and you reach your hand into the opening and you touch a piece of rock worn smooth by 20 centuries of hands groping in the dark. The hands of peasants and kings, of saints and servants, all drawn to this very church to do what you are about to do. And in that one brief moment, you touch the most important place in all of human history. This is the earth that held the cross. You are touching Calvary. Immediately, the centuries fall away, because here is where the blood fell and the women wept, And there, just a few inches away, is where Mary stood watch with John at her side. They were all right in this very spot: the centurion, the two thieves, the guards. Here is where Christ cried out, "I thirst," and where he whispered, "It is finished." And so you withdraw your hand from the dark opening and you stagger to your feet. It's also very disorienting. But then you finally understand that here, in this obscure place, is where everything changed. This day, in this magnificent church and in your homes, we strive to do what pilgrims have done in Jerusalem for millennia. We try to connect with the mystery of the Passion, this great and unparalleled act of love. And yes, somehow we seek to touch Calvary. We hear once more the account of Christ's passion and death. We realize how much he gave and why. But if we're honest, if we think about it, we realize something else. That Calvary is not just one place at one moment in time. No, instead, Calvary is everywhere. It is any place where the body of Christ is scourged and stripped and broken and pierced. There is the Calvary of Italy and the Calvary of Spain, the Calvary of New York and the Calvary of New Jersey. There is the Calvary of the recently diagnosed and the recently laid off. There is the Calvary of nurses and doctors, of police departments and crowded cities. There is the Calvary that dwells within every human heart whenever we turn toward despair and turn our backs on Christ. The world is now haunted with Calvaries. But Calvary isn't the end of the story. Hardly. The great artist, James Tissot, once painted an image of Mary that is the most haunting one I have ever seen. It's called The Holy Virgin in Old Age. It depicts Our Lady at Calvary, but many years after her son's passion. It shows her kneeling before the place which had once held the cross, gazing into the earth, deep in prayer. It was there, at that spot, that her son said, "It is finished." But the Christian story was just beginning, because 20 centuries later, that very place remains a silent witness to what was and a testament as to what would be. When you go to visit the site of the crucifixion today, as you approach that sacred spot, you are struck by something unexpected. You realize that there is only one way to touch Calvary. You must fall to your knees. And there is only one way to move on: by rising. And then you remember something as true today as it was 2,000 years ago. That during these holy days, in this dreadful time in human history, the journey to Calvary ends by rising. Well, at the end of my sermon on Holy Thursday, I had mentioned with great confidence that I am certain that science is going to solve this problem of coronavirus, of this plague. And I hold to that science will solve this. But Jesus will save us, which is what gathers us here far and wide to celebrate the greatest saving action of Jesus. That Jesus Christ looked death squarely in the eye and completely obliterated its power. And so to my friends who are here with us and my friends who are at home or wherever you're watching this, I want to say, Happy Easter. As hard as it is for me to believe this, it was just 1 year ago, last Easter, that I was celebrating in a much different place. I was in the middle of celebrating Easter and in the middle of making a sabbatical up and down the California coast as I was studying the life and times of another saint, Saint Junipero Serra, who established all of the California missions that have become great cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and San Diego and Santa Barbara and so on and so forth. And during my journey throughout that sabbatical that I was on, I became friends with a number of people. And one person I became friendly with was a politician out there. And I'll never forget the text that he sent to me on Easter Sunday last year. He said this, and I remember it verbatim. May Easter be for you all that it is meant to be. It sort of captures the zeitgeist, the spirit of a secularist way of understanding Easter. May Easter be for you all that it is meant to be. Even after a year, I'm still not sure what he meant by that. Now, I want to contrast that with a conversation I had with one of our parishioners just a week ago. Our sisters in our two convents, the IHM sisters and the Assumption sisters, along with myself, during this crisis are reaching out to each and every one of our parishioners. And we're simply calling to ask them, how are they doing? You know, how are they getting through? Are they healthy? Is there anything that we can do for them as the church? Well, last week I wound up speaking with one of our parishioners by the name of Vashti Holden. As a matter of fact, I have a picture here of Vashti. And so I called her and I said, as I was saying to all the other parishioners, Vashti, how are you doing? Is there anything that we can do for you? And so on and so forth. Well, it was very clear after just a couple of minutes that Vashti is a woman of incredibly strong faith. And so I said to her, Vashti, I think I understand the secret to how you're getting through this. And she said, how? And I said, you're a woman of incredibly strong faith. And she started to laugh. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, Father, I passed over from faith to knowledge a long time ago. I don't just believe in the power of Jesus. She said, I know the power of Jesus. And then she took the better part of 3/4 of an hour telling me all the ways that the power of Jesus has worked in her life. I couldn't get a word in edgewise. And so finally I said to her after 45 minutes, it was incredibly edifying, but after 45 minutes I remember saying, Vashti, I'll tell you what, when we get back together for the 10:15 Mass at St. Francis de Sales, I'm going to be tempted to hand the microphone over to you. But I said, you know why I won't do that? And she said, why is that, Father? I said, because I'm never going to get that microphone back. We'd be there for hours. What a difference when someone has that power of faith, or as Vashti said, the power of knowledge. And yet that's the power we hear about. All the disciples, they all talk about it throughout every page of the New Testament. Every page of the New Testament, when you turn the page, it just jumps right off the page. And here's a group of people who want to grab us by the lapels and tell us and shake us and tell us, all the magnificent things that Jesus Christ has done for them. Think back to that first reading that Tony Bush read for us just a few moments ago. It comes to us from the 10th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. And Peter is at the home of a recent convert to Christianity, Cornelius. And he's proclaiming the good news. And this is what he says: "We bear witness to Jesus, the one who ate and drank with us after he had risen from the grave." Folks, let that sink in for just a few moments. We bear witness to Jesus, with whom we ate and drank after he had risen from the grave. That's what Peter is telling us, that this isn't something that can be domesticated or tamed like that text that I received from that politician a year ago. That this is something that's an extraordinary, magnificent event that took place. And they want us to know about this. That's why we have this Paschal candle. It stands here, this Easter candle, like the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. It's an obelisk. It's a testament that Jesus Christ has looked death squarely in the eye and completely shattered its power. That's the message of the New Testament, that Jesus has risen from the grave, that Jesus has destroyed that which scares us most, not the coronavirus, but death itself. And they didn't just speak about it, they lived it. I think of the life of Saint Bartholomew, for example, one of the apostles. What does Bartholomew do to put his money where his mouth was? He continued to proclaim Christ crucified and risen to the point that his enemies looked at him and they filleted him alive. Or think about the story of St. Thomas, who unfortunately has gone down in history as doubting Thomas. Let me tell you what happened to Thomas after he overcame his doubts. He took this message of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and he took it from Israel all the way down into Asia, into India, where he was killed for preaching Christ crucified and risen. Oh, and this St. Peter didn't just talk about it over a meal and a fine glass of wine in Cornelius' home. Instead, what he did is he took this saving message of Jesus Christ, that Jesus had risen from the dead. He took it from Israel across the Mediterranean, and he took it into the belly of the beast. He took it into Rome, and he preached Christ crucified and risen, and he was killed for it. For any of you who have ever been to Rome, I'm sure you have gone to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. You know what St. Peter's Basilica is essentially? It's the world's most beautiful and elaborate grave marker. Because that's where St. Peter went, and that's where St. Peter was crucified upside down, right where St. Peter's is today. And why did he do it? He was so convinced, like Vashti, he was convinced that Jesus had looked death squarely in the eye and beat it. And we do the same thing at every Mass. You know, Michael led us, as we do at every Mass, in procession. And when Michael led us in procession, he led us with a crucifix. What an odd way to begin a religious ceremony, to come down with a crucifix. Let me tell you the origin of that, folks. That goes way back in time. And the reason Christians would do this in a Roman world is that they would show the Roman officials and the pagan believers, look at what you have done to our Jesus. And he beat it, and he conquered it. The crucifix in a procession at Mass at the beginning, in a certain sense, served as a taunt, as if to say, you did this to my Lord? Well, guess what? he won anyway. Friends, that's the power of the resurrection, that Jesus has conquered our greatest foe of all, death itself. And so, because that's true, we have nothing to be afraid of. Dear friends in Christ, that's the message of Jesus Christ, that he has looked death in the eye and beaten its power over us. Certainly, we're going through an incredible time in human history right now. That's why it's so important for us to imitate St. Peter, to imitate St. Thomas, to imitate St. Bartholomew. Yes, to imitate Vashti Holden, and place our faith in Jesus Christ, in whom all of our hope rests. Happy Easter.
이 산전도